Welcome to the podcast on North American literature, hosted by the research group Studies in American Literature and Culture from the University of Granada.
Hello, I'm Sjevold Krabitsyn, the host of this podcast. Today we have a fascinating episode lined up. Joining me is Africa Saeth, a literature student who's been exploring two titanic works of fiction, Moby Dick by Herman Melville and Lolita by Vladimir Nabokov. At first glance, these novels might seem worlds apart. One's about a whale, the other one about a scandalous obsession. But Africa has discovered something they profoundly share, a study of monomaniacal fixation and what happens when obsession meets a lack of accountability. Africa, welcome.
Hello, thank you so much for having me here today. I'm really excited to talk about this. These novels might seem mismatched, but once I got into them, the thematic parallels were just too striking to ignore.
I'm intrigued already. Let's begin with a bit of context. Could you briefly describe the central characters we're going to be talking about, as well as the stories they belong to?
Of course, in Lolita, we follow Humbert, a literature professor who becomes obsessed with Dolores Hayes, a 12-year-old girl he nicknames Lolita, hence the name of the novel. He narrates the story himself, which makes the novel especially disturbing because it's a deeply unreliable and manipulative point of view. And then in Moby Dick, we have Captain Ahab, a whaling captain who is consumed by a need for revenge against the white whale Moby Dick, who took his leg. Ahab's obsession drives the entire journey followed in the novel, and it ultimately leads to destruction.
So, two men, both chasing something, both on very dangerous paths. What drew you to compare these two specific characters?
Well, their intensity and their delusion, mainly. Despite the different settings and goals, one is chasing the whale and the other girl. The depth of the obsession is incredibly similar. Both Ahab and Humbert build these elaborate, self-justifying narratives where they place the blame entirely on the object of their obsession. It's never their fault. The whale is evil, Lolita is seductive, but the reality is neither the whale nor the girl have any real agency in these stories.
So, it's not just the obsession, it's the way they warp reality around it.
Exactly. Psychologically, they're fascinating. Humbert, for instance, constructs his entire framework of nymphets, young girls who are, in his mind, seductive by nature. It's a twisted rationalization that allows him to evade moral responsibility. And Ahab, instead of accepting his injury as the random consequence of nature, transforms Moby Dick into this malevolent force. They both externalize the blame, which allows them to sidestep guilt in ways that are deeply manipulative, but also kind of tragic.
Because somewhere beneath all of that is guilt.
Yes, but it's buried. Um, Both men occasionally let it surface. For Humbert, it leaks through in moments of trembling hesitation or when he refers to himself as a monster or a murderer near the end. And for Ahab, it's more elusive, but there are flickers, especially when he interacts with Starbuck. And at one point, he has a moment of crisis where he almost acknowledges the madness driving him, and he calls himself a fool. But it like Humbert, he suppresses it almost instantly.
Do you think either of them is insane?
That's a really tricky question. Ahab's madness is certainly theatrical. It's almost mythological. He's not mentally ill in a clinical sense. It's more that he's consumed by a symbolic vision of the world, and he believes he's been chosen to confront evil. Humbert, on the other hand, is more grounded in psychological realism. His delusions are crafted from intellect, not really metaphysical fury, sorry. But the core dynamic is the same. Both characters retreat into self-created realities built from obsession, where they alone are the heroes and the villains, and everything literally but themselves.
So, obsession in these cases becomes a way of avoiding the deeper truths.
Precisely, obsession offers them a kind of structure. It gives them purpose, but that purpose is a defense mechanism, a way to suppress pain, guilt, or fear of powerlessness, which ironically makes them even more powerless in the end.
That's a really powerful point. And it's interesting how both novels engage with unreliable narration. Can we talk more about that?
Well, definitely. Both novels are masterclasses in unreliable narration, but they approach it differently. Humbert constantly tries to manipulate the reader with charm, irony, and poetic flair. But from the opening line, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, he positions us not just as readers, but as jurors. He's actively trying to persuade. That performative aspect sets the tone for everything that follows, and it's not just a confession, it's a seduction.
And Melville does something similar with Ahab, though it's filtered through Ishmael, right?
Yeah, that's what makes Moby Dick more structurally complex. We get Ahab's madness filtered through Ishmael's narration, which is mostly rational and philosophical, but even Ishmael becomes swept up in Ahab's intensity. As readers, we start to see Ahab through a mythic lens, not because he's objectively heroic, but because the language elevates him. Melville uses religious and epic diction, like Ahab is a grand and godly, godlike man, someone shaped in an age when the world was getting dark. And just this language insists on his greatness, even as his actions reveal him to be dangerously unhinged.
So the prose style itself contributes to the distortion.
Exactly. Nabokov's prose is lush, musical, filled with clever wordplay, and you almost get like hypnotized by the beauty of it. But the irony is brutal. You're being lulled by the rhythm while the meaning remains deeply disturbing. It's a deliberate trick. Melville, on the other hand, plays with tone constantly. The variety keeps you off balance. It reflects the ocean's unpredictability, but it also mirrors Ahab's chaotic inner world. Both writers use language not just to tell a story, but to trap us in the narrator's mental state.
That's such an interesting point. The idea that the prose becomes part of the character's psychology.
Yes, in Lolita, Humbert's elaborate syntax and references are part of how he intellectualizes his crimes. He wants to be seen as cultured, witty, misunderstood. In a, in a way, his eloquence becomes his armor, and Ahab speaks like a prophet or biblical figure. It's not just what they say, but how they say it. You know, that reveals what they're hiding. Like, for example, guilt, obsession, and the desperate need to justify themselves and what they do.
That's fascinating. There's also a kind of theatricality to how both characters behave. Did you notice that?
Yes, I did. That was one of the most surprising and compelling similarities, actually. Ahab's speeches often read like Shakespearean soliloquies. He's so dramatic. There are even chapters in Moby Dick that are formatted like stage plays, which is very interesting. And Humbert, as I said, opens the novel like he's on trial. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, establishing Humbert as both narrator and actor, performing for an imagined audience. It is very performative, and he sees himself as a tragic, misunderstood hero. They're both putting on a show, not just for others, but for themselves, to maintain the illusion that they're justified.
It's fascinating how that illusion is so closely tied to power. Do you think that both characters are, let's say, ultimately trying to control something they know they can't?
Yeah, absolutely. Power is a huge part of it. Ahab wants dominion over nature, over fate, even over the metaphysical forces he believes the whale represents. And Humbert, he just wants total control over Lolita, where she goes, who she sees, what she reads. He, well, he literally drugs her and kidnaps her at one point, which shows how far he'll go to maintain that illusion of control. But the irony is that both men are deeply powerless. Ahab can't control the sea or the whale, and Humbert can't control Lolita's inner life, her grief, her personality, or her resistance. So their obsession becomes a way to kind of compensate for that impotence.
And maybe that's where the line between passion and obsession gets blurry.
Exactly, yes. Passion is, well, like there's a difference. Passion is mutual, it's dynamic. And obsession is static and consuming. It doesn't evolve, it just really intensifies. Ahab and Humbert don't really adapt to the real changing world around them. They freeze their targets in place. For Ahab, Moby Dick becomes not just a whale, but a cosmic symbol of evil. Likewise, Humbert romanticizes Lolita into a timeless nymphet, a symbol of forbidding allure, but that image is entirely his own projection.
So neither Moby Dick nor Lolita exists as a real individual in their minds?
Exactly, that's what makes the obsession so dangerous. Both characters erase the humanity of the object they're fixated on. Lolita isn't Dolores. She's not a grieving child or a victim or even a person. She's like the symbol and most importantly a nymphet for him. Ahab doesn't care about like whales in general or even the actual animal that hurt him. Moby Dick becomes a vessel for everything Ahab hates in the universe. It's the objectification in the most literal sense, turning someone or something into a static object to fuel a personal myth.
And that myth always serves the same purpose to avoid self examination.
Yeah, it's a defense. Obsession gives them a clean external enemy. It's much easier than confronting their own brokenness or the moral weight over their choices. And the tragedy is their pursuit of control just leads to greater chaos. Both men end up spiraling, not because their goals are out of reach, but because their very way of seeing the world is flawed.
That performative angle really adds a layer of tragedy. Speaking of which, do either of them ever confront their own behavior?
Well, I mean, they do, but only fleetingly. Ahab has a powerful moment in chapter 132 where he reflects on his wasted life and calls himself fool. It's a rare glimpse of self awareness, but it really doesn't stop him. And Humbert too has moments where he admits to the darkness of his desires. There's, like, for example, there's a scene where he's sitting in a park pretending to read while watching younger girls play. And he knows it's wrong. He even seems to tremble with guilt. But again, it doesn't really change anything. In both cases, there's a recognition of guilt, but it's quickly buried until under self-pity and justification.
That brings up that brings us to the idea of accountability. Would you say either character ever takes true responsibility for what they've done?
No, I wouldn't. Both characters do a great job of presenting themselves as victims. Humbert calls himself poor Humbert, and Ahab talks about fate almost like he had no choice. It's a classical evasion. Instead of owning their actions, they construct these narratives where they are merely responding to something larger, something outside of themselves.
So even when things fall apart, neither of them really see themselves as the cause?
Exactly. They both fall into this philosophical trap of fate or destiny. Ahab insists that he was driven by some higher force, that he's merely following a path already carved by the universe. And Humbert, he frames himself as tragically doomed, consistently invoking his weakness or madness as if that absolves him. There's even a scene where he says something like, "You can always count on a murderer for a fancy prose style." That's witty, sure, but it's also a dodge. Performance of guilt rather than true contrition.
It's like they're staging their guilt in ways that let them keep their delusions intact.
Yes, that's, yeah. What's fascinating is that both men are intellectually capable of seeing themselves clearly. They're not stupid. They're reflective, poetic, even brilliant. but they use that brilliance to twist their own moral logic. Humbert, for example, doesn't just lie to us, he lies to himself, layering metaphor over metaphor until he no longer has to face the raw truth of what he's doing. And Ahab, he intellectualizes his hatred. He elevates it into a metaphysical mission, but it's still a kind of cowardice. They're both too proud or too broken to say, I was wrong and it was my fault.
So instead of taking responsibility, they wrap themselves in this language of fate and grandeur.
Yeah, and that language is seductive, both for them and for us as well. That's part of the genius of these novels. As readers, we're drawn in by the grandeur of Ahab's speeches or the elegance of Humbert's prose, but that's also the danger. The language becomes a mask. Ahab talks like a Shakespearean king, but he's just a man who can't deal with pain. Humbert writes like a romantic poet, but he's just a predator who has ruined a child's life. Their eloquence doesn't excuse them, it exposes how far they'll go to avoid accountability.
And yet both narratives lead to ruin, right?
Exactly. Ahab dies in his final encounter with Moby Dick. He is destroyed by his own obsession. And while Humbert doesn't die, he ends up completely alone, having lost Lolita, and recognized in far too late the immense harm he's caused. He even kills Quilty, another man who pursued Lolita, but that act doesn't redeem him. It's just another violent consequence of his inability to accept responsibility. By the way, do you know what I find really fascinating and kind of ironic? Ahab spends the entire story obsessively chasing the whale, rallying an entire crew behind him, and still ends up being killed by the very thing he was trying to destroy. Meanwhile, Humbert, who never set out to kill anyone, actually ends up murdering Quilty. And Quilty wasn't even part of Humbert's original obsession. He barely existed in his world at first. And yet, in a strange way, it's like Humbert ends up fulfilling Ahab's doomed mission. That parallel really sticks with me.
Well, that is truly interesting. Something else that really stands out is the idea of a long pursuit in both stories. That's one of the key parallels you notice too, right?
Absolutely. Both Ahab and Humbert are on these obsessive quests. Ahab's driven by a thirst of revenge and some warped sense of like justice, while Humbert's chasing this idolized version of Lolita, but only while she fits in his idea of a nymphet. And even though they both reach the end of their hunt, in the sense that they both find what they're looking for, neither of them actually gets the resolution they want. In the end, they are both forced to face outcomes that they never really wanted.
It's so interesting that both stories end with that kind of emptiness. Like, all that pursuit, all that intensity, and for what?
Yeah, that's what makes these books so powerful. They show how obsession isn't romantic or heroic, it's just destructive. Both characters believe they're on some kind of noble mission, but in reality, they're just spiraling, dragging everyone around them into chaos.
Before we wrap up, Africa, what do you think makes this comparison between Moby Dick and Lolita academically relevant today?
Well, I think what's really worth diving into is how both novels treat obsession, not just as a psychological issue, but as a narrative engine. It's what drives the story forward, but it also opens up bigger questions about human nature, morality, and how limited our self awareness can be. Stylistically, both books experiment with voice, performance, and dramatic structure in some really fresh and original ways. One thing I find oddly amusing is how both Humbert and Ahab, especially Humbert actually, refer to themselves in the third person at times. And even though the novels come from completely different time periods, they feel surprisingly modern in how they handle unreliable narration, or perception, and the way people rationalize destructive behavior.
That's such a compelling takeaway. Thank you, Africa, for bringing such deep insight to these two iconic novels. It's been a pleasure having you on the podcast.
Thank you again. Thank you so much for having me. It was so wonderful to share this with you.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Keep reading, keep questioning, and stay curious.